This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. The Orange found the ridgeline first. Cole Braddock saw it through the cabin window while cleaning the rifle he hadn't fired in 11 months. A thin smear of color where the dark tree line met the darker sky. And for a second, it looked like sunrise arriving 6 hours early. Then the smell came through the gap beneath the door. Pine sap and char, and something older, something chemical. And he set the rifle down on the table beside the lantern and stood. Fire. East Ridge. Maybe 4 miles out. Ghost rose from his spot by the door in one slow, fluid motion. No sound, no scramble, just a body going from still to ready, as though someone had flipped a switch buried deep in the animal's spine. The German shepherd stood rigid, ears locked forward, eyes on the same window Cole was watching. His chest didn't move. Even his breathing had stopped. Lungs locked, muscles drawn tight, every cell pointed at the same window. Cole crossed to the window and pressed 2 fingers against the glass. Cool. Wind coming from the northwest, which meant the fire was moving east, away from the cabin, away from the creek drainage that served as his water source and his one concession to staying alive in these mountains. He should stay. He should close the window, check the fire break he'd cut around the property line in June, and wait. That was the protocol for a man who had spent 3 years building a life around not being found. He turned from the window and reached for his weather notebook on the shelf beside the canned food and the water containers and the first aid kit he still restocked every 90 days out of a habit he could not seem to break. The pages were filled with small, precise handwriting. Temperature, wind direction, humidity, barometric pressure. Each entry dated and timed with the instinct of someone trained to read conditions before stepping into them. He flipped to today's page. Winds at 12 knots, gusting to 18. Relative humidity, 14%. The kind of numbers that turned a campfire into a county emergency. The cabin was 12 miles from the nearest road and 3 miles beyond the last maintained trail. A single room of timber and corrugated metal that Cole had repaired himself during his first winter here, when the work of replacing rotten joists and sealing window frames had given his hands something to do besides shake. Everything inside was ordered. Cot against the north wall, table and chair beneath the window, lantern, tools, notebook. No photographs, no phone. No mail except the monthly supply list he left in a box at the trailhead, and the bags of dog food and canned goods that appeared there 2 days later, paid for in cash he'd earned cutting firewood. 3 years of this. 3 years of not answering. Ghost padded to the door. His nose worked the gap at the bottom, sampling whatever the night was carrying, and a low sound came from his throat. Not a growl, not a whine. Something between the two that Cole had learned to pay attention to. I see it. Then a sound cut through the distance. Faint, thin, swallowed almost entirely by the miles and the timber and the wind. A voice. Human, pitched high and ragged, torn open by distance or pain, or both. Cole's hands stopped. Ghost barked once, sharp, directed, his entire body angled toward the south slope, where the old logging road switchbacked down toward the valley. The dog looked at Cole. then at the door, then back at Cole. The sound came again, closer, or maybe just clearer now that the wind had shifted. A single word, stretched thin, impossible to make out, but the frequency was unmistakable. Anyone who'd spent time in combat, or in a hospital, or on a mountainside after a helicopter went wrong, knew what that frequency meant. Distress. Real distress. The sound a person makes when they've run out of options, and all that's left is noise. Someone was screaming on the logging road. Cole grabbed his pack from beside the door, the go bag he kept ready despite having nowhere to go. 22 pounds of medical supplies, water, a headlamp, a space blanket, and a fixed-blade knife. His hands moved through the familiar geometry of it, cinching the waist belt, checking the chest strap, and the motion itself was a kind of language his body still spoke fluently, even after 3 years of trying to forget why he'd learned it. 18 years in pararescue, 6 deployments. How many times had he grabbed a pack and moved toward a sound like that? He'd stopped counting before his 3rd tour. He opened the door. Ghost was already through it, moving fast down the trail, leading with his nose, his dark coat vanishing into the trees within seconds. Cole followed. His boots found the path from memory. The air tasted of smoke, thicker now, the orange glow throwing shadows that crawled across the forest floor and made the spaces between the trees feel narrower than they were. He hadn't moved this fast in 3 years. His body remembered before his mind agreed. The logging road was a scar across the mountain, gravel and ruts, and the ghosts of tire tracks from a timber operation that had shut down before Cole ever arrived in these hills. He found the vehicle 200 yards below the switchback, where the road bent hard around a granite outcrop. A Forest Service truck, green and white, its front end crumpled against a lodgepole pine that had fallen across the road. Not from the fire, but from the wind the fire was pushing ahead of itself. The tree had come down fast, and the driver had swerved too late. Ghost was already there, circling the wreck in tight, controlled loops, nose low, checking for threats before checking for survivors. The dog completed 1 full circuit, then sat 3 feet from the driver's door and looked at Cole. Clear. Cole dropped to one knee beside the cab. Intact. The windshield had cracked, but held. Inside, a woman, 40s, short brown hair matted with sweat, blood on her forehead from where she'd hit the steering wheel. She was conscious. Her eyes tracked him when he pulled the door open, and there was more focus in them than fear, which told him she was alert, and probably didn't have a concussion severe enough to worry about in the next 15 minutes. "Don't move your head. Can you feel your hands?" "Yeah." Her voice was strained but controlled. "My leg. Something's on my leg." He leaned in. A section of the dashboard had buckled inward, pinning her left leg below the knee. Not crushing it, the angle was wrong for a crush injury, but holding it firm enough that she couldn't pull free. He checked her pupils with his headlamp, equal and reactive. Pulse at the carotid, strong, slightly elevated, 90 beats per minute. No arterial bleed visible. Airway clear. Breathing labored but bilateral. Skin warm, dry, capillary refill under 2 seconds. The assessment took 4 seconds. It used to take 3. "I'm going to free your leg. You're going to feel pressure, then release. Keep your head still and breathe out when I tell you." She nodded once. Small motion, disciplined. He braced his right boot against the frame of the cab and worked the dashboard panel with both hands, finding the gap where the metal had bent, leveraging it upward with his shoulder while pressing his knee against the door frame for stability. The metal groaned, resisted. He adjusted his grip, found a better purchase point, and pulled again. The panel shifted 3 inches, then 4. Enough. Breathe out. Now. She did. He shoved the panel up and held it. She gasped and pulled her leg free. Cole released the metal and sat back on his heels. His left shoulder burned. The rotator cuff he'd torn on a fast rope insertion 8 years ago, never properly healed. A souvenir from a career that kept giving long after the last paycheck. The smoke was thicker now, visibility dropping to 40 yards, and through the trees to the north, he could see the orange glow climbing the canopy. "Can you walk?" She tested the leg, grimacing, rolling the ankle, flexing the knee. "I think so, yeah." "Then we move, now." He helped her out of the cab, taking her weight on his good side, and they started down the road toward the trailhead where he'd left his truck. Ghost ranged ahead, circling back every 50 yards to confirm the path was clear. His body a dark blur against the smoke that had begun to settle into the drainage like fog. The dog never ranged farther than voice distance. 3 years in the mountains had taught him the boundaries, and he held them without being told. The woman didn't ask who he was. She focused on walking, one hand gripping his shoulder, her jaw set against whatever her leg was telling her. She was trained, he could tell. Controlled breathing, no wasted energy on panic, no unnecessary questions. She moved efficiently despite the pain, distributing her weight to minimize stress on the injured leg. That wasn't civilian behavior. That was someone who'd been taught to keep moving when moving hurt. They reached his truck in 9 minutes. He opened the passenger door and helped her in. Ghost jumped into the bed without command, settling into the corner where he could see the road behind them and the trail ahead. "What's your name?" He closed her door without answering, walked around to the driver's side, started the engine. He drove toward town on the fire access road, headlights off, navigating by the amber glow that painted the ridge and the memory of a road he'd driven in darkness more times than he could count. A half-mile from the main highway, where the fire station access road branched south, he pulled to the shoulder and left the engine running. The fire crews were already moving. He could see headlights and red flashers converging from 2 directions. Someone would find her here within minutes. He got out, walked to her side, opened the door. "You just pulled me out of a wreck in the middle of a fire." She was looking at him now, studying his face in the glow from the dashboard instruments. "And you won't give me your name." "Doesn't matter." He helped her out and walked her to the center of the access road, where the gravel was flat and the approaching headlights would catch her immediately. "Stay off the leg. Tell them you need an X-ray of the left tib-fib. The swelling's soft tissue, not compartment, but they should rule it out." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" But he was already walking back to the truck, his silhouette dissolving into the smoke, and Ghost was standing in the truck bed, watching her with amber eyes that held a strange, steady patience, as though he understood precisely what Cole was doing and had long ago stopped questioning it. They drove back toward the cabin. No headlights. The fire glow lit the ridgeline to the east, and beneath it the valley lay dark and still. And somewhere in that darkness, the woman was being found by people who would ask the right questions and get the wrong answers about the man who'd carried her out of the wreckage and vanished before the first engine arrived. At the cabin, Cole killed the engine and sat in the silence for a long time. His hands smelled of smoke and blood and the cold metal of a stranger's dashboard. His shoulder throbbed. The adrenaline was draining out of him in slow, familiar waves, leaving behind a heaviness that settled into his joints and his chest and the space behind his eyes where exhaustion lived. Ghost jumped down from the bed and trotted to the front door, then stopped. He sniffed the ground near the porch step, circled once, and lowered his head towards something half buried in the loose dirt. He picked it up with careful jaws, delicate, purposeful, with the deliberate attention of an animal that has been given a task, and carried it to where Cole was climbing out of the truck. He dropped it at Cole's boots. It was small, caked in mud and something darker. One edge blackened, the leather curled and blistered by heat. "What did you find?" The lantern threw a circle of yellow light across the table. Cole sat with the object in front of him, turning it slowly in his hands while water dripped from the leather onto the pine surface. A wallet. He turned it under the light, moving it slowly. The leather was split along one side, the stitching melted into a hard ridge where heat had fused the thread into a dark line. One half was charred, the side that had faced upward, exposed to the fire passing over the ground above. The other half was intact, the leather still supple, still holding its shape, protected by the soil packed around it. Damp soil. Earth that hadn't burned. Cole set the wallet down and studied the mud still clinging to the intact side. Dense. Cool. The kind that forms 6 inches below the surface, where moisture holds even through the driest month of the year. He'd spent 3 years walking this ground, reading its layers, learning its moods. He knew what 6-inch soil felt like in his hands. He knew what it meant. The wallet had been buried, deliberately. Someone had placed it beneath the surface before the fire ever reached this ridge. The flames had passed overhead, intense enough to sear the exposed edge through a thin layer of topsoil, but the bulk of the wallet had survived in the cool, damp earth below. Cole sat back. His mind moved through the sequence without emotion, the way it had been trained to move. Assess, categorize, conclude. If a man falls off a trail, an accident, a misstep, his wallet stays in his pocket, or it falls beside the body, or it's collected by the people who find him and returned to next of kin. A wallet doesn't travel 6 inches underground on its own. Someone buried it. Someone who didn't want it found. And the fire, weeks or months later, had almost finished the job. Almost. But Ghost had found the seam where the burned surface met the unburned earth, and he'd pulled this object from the space between destruction and preservation and carried it home. Cole opened what was left of the billfold. The plastic window had fused to the card beneath, and he peeled it apart carefully, the smell of burned synthetic mixing with the musty tang of wet leather. The photograph was gone, melted into an unreadable dark smear. But the card underneath was military issue. Department of Defense identification, the laminate thick enough to protect the print beneath. Daniel R. Harlan, Sergeant, USAF. Date of birth, service number, expiration date. The face was gone, but the name was sharp and clear, and it hit Cole with a force that had nothing to do with surprise, and everything to do with the kind of recognition that lives in the body rather than the mind. He set the card on the table. His hands didn't move, his breathing didn't change. From the outside, nothing about him shifted at all. But inside, something very old and very heavy turned over, and the room felt smaller. He knew that name. He had carried the man it belonged to across 400 meters of open ground in Helmand Province, while tracers split the air above them, and the dust tasted of blood and copper, and the helicopter that was supposed to be there in 90 seconds was already 3 minutes late. He had carried him because Danny couldn't walk, and because Cole was a PJ, and that was what PJs did. That others may live. And because the alternative was leaving him in the dirt, and Cole Brannock did not leave people in the dirt. That was 7 years ago. Another country, another version of himself. And then the voicemails came back. Not the words themselves, he'd never listened past the first few seconds, but the sound of Danny's voice, steady and measured the way it always was. The same calm cadence Danny used on the radio under fire, leaving message after message on a phone that Cole had eventually stopped charging. "Cole, it's Danny. Call me back." "Cole, I found something. I need to talk to you." "Cole, please." He'd deleted them. Every one. Not out of cruelty, but out of the terrible efficiency of a man who had decided that his old life was a room he could simply lock and walk away from. He had believed that silence was a wall thick enough to hold. He had believed that not answering was a form of answer. He had believed these things because the alternative, picking up the phone, hearing Danny's voice, being pulled back into a world where people needed him, and he might fail them again, was a door he could not afford to open. Ghost sat 3 feet from the table, his head tilted slightly to one side, watching. The dog didn't approach, didn't press close. He held the distance with a patience that seemed almost deliberate, reading whatever frequency of grief or recognition Cole was broadcasting, and waited. Cole looked at the dog for a long time, then back at the card on the table. The wallet was half burned and buried 6 inches deep. Wallets don't bury themselves. Neither do the men who carry them. Elk Bend sat in a narrow valley where the Clark Fork tributary bent south. A town of 1,200 people arranged along a single main street, like items on a shelf. Hardware store, bar, post office, general store, the county building that doubled as town hall and courthouse, and whatever else the county needed it to be on a given Tuesday. The mountains pressed in from both sides, close enough that the sun reached Main Street for only 6 hours a day in winter, and the shadows of the ridgeline fell across the easternmost buildings by 4 in the afternoon, even in August. It was a timber town, or had been. The mill had closed 11 years ago, and what remained was a population that had learned to hold on without entirely understanding what they were holding on to. Cole hadn't driven into Elk Bend in 4 months. The last time was to buy chainsaw chain and a bag of dog food, and he'd completed both transactions in under 7 minutes without speaking to anyone who wasn't behind a register. Today was different. Today he parked the truck on the side street behind the bar, left Ghost in the cab with the window cracked 3 inches and the water bowl on the passenger seat. "Stay." Ghost dropped his chin onto his paws and watched Cole walk away with an expression that managed to convey both obedience and deep skepticism about the decision being made. The bar was called the Elbow Room, and it had the look of a place that knew exactly what it was and had stopped making excuses decades ago. Dark wood paneling, a pool table with repaired felt, neon beer signs providing most of the ambient light, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked since sometime during the second Bush administration. 3 men sat at the bar. 2 more occupied a back table near the emergency exit. Conversations paused when Cole walked in. They always did. He was the man from the mountain, the one who lived alone past the last trail, and there was something in the way he carried himself. Upright, alert, eyes touching every corner of the room before settling on the empty stool at the far end of the bar that discouraged casual interaction. He sat. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Tull with a gray beard that reached his chest and hands large enough to palm a basketball, set a coffee in front of him without being asked. Black, no sugar. Tull remembered things like that. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy." "You hear about the fire up on the East Ridge?" "Saw it." Tull wiped the bar in slow concentric circles, the rag moving across wood that had been polished by elbows and forearms for 40 years. "Burned about 800 acres before they got a line around it. Started somewhere on the disputed land, up past the old survey markers. Nobody knows how." "Disputed?" "Boundary issue. Been going on for years. County says the line is one place. Forest Service says it's another." Tull shrugged. "Ridley Timber's been logging up there regardless. Nobody pushes back because Hank Ridley signs half the paychecks in this valley." Cole filed that. He turned the coffee cup between his hands, but didn't drink. "I'm looking for information about someone. A man named Daniel Harlan. Would have been in town about 8-9 months ago." The circles stopped. Tull's hand went flat on the bar, the rag bunched beneath his palm. At the back table, one of the 2 men shifted in his chair. "Danny Harlan." Tull said the name as though it had a weight he'd been trying to set down for months. "Yeah, I remember him. What happened to him?" Tull glanced toward the back table. The men there had stopped pretending not to listen. One of them was watching Cole directly now, his beer untouched in front of him. "Fell. Up on the ridge trail east of town. Last November. They found him at the bottom of a scree field after a hiker spotted something. Coroner ruled it accidental. Exposure and blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. City guy, they said. Didn't know the terrain." Cole's jaw tightened. The sentence sat between them on the bar like a wrong card dealt face up. He wasn't a city guy. "I'm just telling you what the report said." Tull's voice had dropped, and he'd moved slightly closer, putting his body between Cole and the men at the back table. "You might want to be careful asking about him around here. People get uncomfortable." "People or specific people?" Tull picked up the rag again, started wiping. Didn't answer. Cole laid a 5 on the bar and stood. The coffee was untouched and already cooling. He walked out without looking at the men in the back, though he felt their attention track him across the room and through the door and into the flat white light outside. The smoke haze from the fire had turned the August sun into a pale disk that produced heat but no color. Everything looked washed out, faded, as though someone had drained the saturation from the valley. He crossed to the truck and opened the door. Ghost was sitting upright in the passenger seat, and when Cole appeared, the dog didn't greet him. No tail, no excitement. Instead, Ghost froze with his muzzle hovering above the water bowl, perfectly still, reading something on Cole's skin and in his breathing that told him now was not the time for normal. Yeah, Cole started the engine. I know. A PJ who survived INDOC and 6 deployments doesn't fall off a trail. Not unless someone helps him. She found the cabin on the 3rd day. Cole was splitting firewood behind the structure. A task he didn't need to do in August, but his hands required occupation, and the axe provided it in a rhythm that occupied the body without demanding much from the mind. When Ghost's head snapped up from where he lay in the shade of the woodpile, both ears forward, body still. Then one ear rotated independently, tracking a sound Cole couldn't hear yet, and the dog rose to his feet and padded to the corner of the cabin where the trail emerged from the trees. No growl, no bark, just attention. Whatever was approaching, Ghost hadn't classified it yet. The Forest Service truck appeared a minute later. Different vehicle from the one on the logging road. This one undamaged, the hood clean. It stopped 20 yards from the cabin, and the engine died with a click that carried clearly across the silence. Jenna Ward stepped out. Her left leg was wrapped in an elastic bandage from ankle to mid-calf, and she favored it slightly as she walked. But her posture was straight, and her eyes were already moving. The cabin, the firewood, the axe in the stump, the dog at the corner, the man who had stopped swinging mid-stroke and was watching her with a stillness that most people reserved for holding their breath. "I tracked your plates," she said. No greeting, no warmth, no pretense. "County database. The truck's registered to a P.O. box in Missoula, but you fueled up at the Cenex outside Elk Bend 3 times this summer, and the station attendant remembers the dog." Cole set the axe head down on the stump and rested both hands on the handle. His breathing was even. His face offered nothing. "That's a lot of work to say thank you." "I'm not here to say thank you." She stopped 10 feet from the porch, close enough for conversation, far enough to respect whatever boundary the distance represented. She was measuring it, he realized, choosing the gap with the same precision he used to choose cover positions. "My name is Jenna Ward. I'm a fire investigator with the Forest Service Regional Office. I'm looking into the origin of the East Ridge fire." The burn path crossed a section of ridge where there was a fatality last winter. A man named Daniel Harlan. There was an accident. Cole's grip shifted on the axe handle. A micro-adjustment, 3 fingers repositioning. The kind of movement that means something only to people trained to read hands under stress. She was trained. "You knew him." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to. Your hands changed when I said the name." Neither of them moved. The smoke haze hung in the trees, softening the edges of everything, turning the light a half shade dimmer than it should have been. And in that muted space, they studied each other with the careful attention of 2 people accustomed to being the sharpest observer in any room, and unaccustomed to meeting their match. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a business card, held it toward him between two fingers. If you think of anything relevant to the fire investigation, or to anything else, I am based at the Forest Service district office in town, for the next few weeks at least. Cole didn't take the card. He didn't move. Jenna held it there for 3 more seconds, then set it on the porch railing, turned, and started back toward her truck. Her gait was controlled. She didn't look back. That was when Ghost moved. The dog had been standing at the corner of the cabin through the entire exchange, motionless, his amber eyes tracking between Cole and the stranger, with the calm assessment of an animal operating on frequencies humans couldn't access. But now he stepped forward, not toward Cole, toward her. He crossed the distance between the cabin and the truck at an easy trot, his head lowered slightly, and when he reached Jenna, he didn't jump, didn't bark, didn't demand. He simply extended his nose toward her hand and held it there, sampling, deciding. His tail neither wagging nor still, but suspended in a kind of neutral readiness. She stood very still and let him. She knew dogs, or at least she knew not to move. Ghost held the contact for 5 seconds. Then he pulled away, turned, and walked back to the cabin. He sat down beside Cole's leg and looked up at him once before settling his gaze forward, as though a decision had been reached and documented. Jenna got into the truck without saying anything about what had just happened. The engine started. She backed carefully down the trail and vanished into the trees. Cole stared at the space where the dog had crossed to the stranger. 3 years. Ghost had never gone to anyone, not once. Not the mail carrier who left packages at the trailhead. Not the Forest Service crew who cleared brush in June. Not the old woman at the Cenex gas station who kept a box of dog biscuits on her counter and spoke to every animal that entered her line of sight. He had chosen Cole, and only Cole, and that exclusion had felt, in the wordless arithmetic of shared solitude, like proof that their arrangement was correct, that the isolation was mutual, that the silence between them was a language sufficient for two. Now the dog had walked to a woman whose name Cole did not want to know, and had come back carrying something invisible that shifted the weight of the air inside the cabin. What was that about? Ghost didn't answer. He lay down in the shade, legs folded beneath him, and closed his eyes. And whatever verdict he'd reached about the woman with the bandaged leg and the sharp questions, he was keeping it to himself. The deputy arrived before sunrise. Cole was awake. He was always awake before sunrise, his internal clock set to a rhythm carved into him by 18 years of being needed at hours when most of the world slept. And he heard the vehicle on the access road a full minute before headlights swept across the cabin wall. Ghost heard it sooner. The dog moved to the door and stood there, not rigid, not alarmed, but fully present, his ears rotating to track the engine sound as it grew louder and then stopped. Cole dressed, boots, jacket. The rifle stayed where it was, leaning against the wall beside the table, visible from the window if someone thought to look. The county cruiser parked behind his truck. A young deputy stepped out. Clean uniform, polished badge, the particular posture of a man who had been given a script and was doing his best with it. He adjusted his belt as he walked to the porch, and when he saw Ghost standing in the doorway, his hand drifted to his hip before he caught himself and redirected it to his belt buckle. Cole opened the door. "Help you?" "Morning, sir." The smile was assembled, not felt. "Just a wellness check, after the fire and all. Making sure everyone out this way is accounted for and doing all right." "I'm accounted for." "That's good to hear. Real good." The deputy's eyes moved past Cole into the cabin, cataloging. The table, the lantern, the rifle. "The mayor, Mayor Ridley, he wanted us to make sure everyone's safe. Lot of folks out here without cell service, and with the fire, I don't have cell service on purpose." The deputy nodded, his smile holding, his eyes still working. Ghost stood at Cole's side, and the dog's attention had narrowed from general alertness to a specific point. Not the deputy's face, but his hands, tracking each small movement with a focus that most people would find unsettling if they noticed it. The deputy didn't notice. "Is there anything else?" "No, sir, just the check." He took a step backward, his hand drifting again before settling at his side. "You take care now." Cole watched the cruiser reverse down the access road, turn, and disappear behind the first stand of trees. The dust hung in the air for 30 seconds after the sound of the engine faded. Then the forest closed around the cabin again, and the silence returned with a weight that felt deliberate. That wasn't a wellness check. Ghost's tail dropped a half-inch. Slow, controlled. A lowering that Cole had learned to read as confirmation. He stood on the porch for a long time, looking at the trail where the cruiser had been. Mayor Ridley. The name Tull had mentioned in connection with the disputed land boundaries. The name attached to the timber company that had been logging where it shouldn't. And now, a deputy at his door, asking questions that weren't questions, checking on a man nobody checked on, 3 days after Cole had started asking about Danny Harlan. He pulled on his hiking boots and laced them tight, filled a water bottle, clipped the small waist pack with the GPS and the folding knife and the notebook he used for terrain observations. Ghost was already at the tree line, waiting, his body angled toward the east ridge where the burn scar began. They moved into the burn scar together. The fire had passed through here 3 days ago and left behind a landscape stripped to its skeleton. Charred trunks stood in rows like fence posts in a field of ash, their bark split and blackened, their branches reduced to carbon fingers reaching at nothing. The ground was still warm in places. Cole could feel it through his boot soles, and the air carried a mineral smell of cooked stone layered beneath the sweeter, stranger scent of sap that had boiled inside the wood before the bark gave way. Ghost worked ahead with his nose low, zigzagging across the ground in tight, methodical patterns, his body tensing and releasing as each scent was processed and filed. He wasn't wandering. He was tracking. Something specific that Cole couldn't name, a signature buried in the ash that the dog's 400 million scent receptors were pulling apart the way a chemist separates compounds in a lab. Cole followed, reading the ground with different instruments. His eyes. The fire had stripped away the camouflage. Everything the forest usually hid was exposed now. Root networks, rock formations, drainage channels, the subtle grade changes that determined where water collected and where it ran. And a quarter-mile past the access road, pressed into the gray surface of settled ash, a set of boot prints. He crouched. The prints were clear and sharp. Not firefighter boots, not trail shoes. Work boots, heavy, with steel shank tread patterns. They hadn't been here during the fire. The ash had settled in a uniform layer after the flames passed, and these prints were pressed cleanly on top of it, edges crisp, depth consistent. Recent. Within the last day, maybe two. Someone had walked here after the fire. Someone who wasn't part of the suppression crew, wasn't a hiker, wasn't lost. The stride was even, purposeful, a man who knew where he was going. Ghost returned to Cole's side, nose working the edge of the nearest print, then lifted his head and looked northeast. Toward the ridge. Toward the place where Danny Harlan had reportedly fallen. Cole stood. He followed the prints for 100 yards through the ash field, Ghost keeping pace at his left flank, until they reached a section of ground that looked different from everything around it. Darker, broken, the ash disturbed in a pattern that wasn't natural. Freshly turned earth. Someone had been digging here. The prints circled the disturbed soil twice, paused at the center, then reversed direction and headed back toward the access road. They had come. They had searched, and they had left. Cole crouched again. He studied the dig site without touching it. Shallow. Sloppy. Whoever did this was looking for something specific and didn't find it. The hole was maybe 18 inches deep, the dirt piled carelessly to one side, and at the bottom, the soil was the same cool, damp earth he'd seen clinging to Danny's wallet. This was where Ghost had found it. The dog had smelled the buried leather through 6 inches of soil and ash, had pulled it free from this exact spot, and had carried it 2 miles back to the cabin. And now, someone else had come looking for the same thing. Someone who knew there was something buried here. Someone who wanted it back. The boot prints led toward the ridge where Danny Harlan supposedly fell. They stopped at a patch of freshly disturbed earth. Then they turned around. Cole stood. He looked at Ghost. The dog looked back, ears forward, body still, waiting for whatever came next. All right. They walked toward the ridge. The ridge trail climbed through burned timber for a half-mile before it broke above the tree line and crossed a granite shelf that jutted from the mountainside like a jaw. Below it, a scree field fanned out in a long gray tongue, loose rock and gravel, and the scattered bones of trees that had fallen from the slope above and shattered on the way down. This was where Danny Harlan had died. According to the coroner's report, according to the bartender, according to the story this town had agreed to tell. Cole stood at the edge and read the terrain. The shelf was 12 feet wide at its narrowest, the surface rough but stable, dry granite with enough texture to grip a boot sole even in wet conditions. The trail approached from the south along a moderate grade, steep enough to elevate the heart rate, nowhere near steep enough to cause a fall for anyone in reasonable physical condition. The exposure was on the north side, where the shelf dropped 40 feet to the scree below. No railing, no warning markers, but the drop-off was visible from 30 yards away, impossible to miss in daylight. Cole crouched and ran his hand across the stone's surface. Dry, even, except for the natural grain of the granite. No loose gravel, no slick patches, no moss, no ice. Not in November, not at this elevation, not on south-facing rock that absorbs sun for 8 hours a day. He stood and looked at the scree field below. The angle was wrong. A man who lost his footing on this shelf would fall north toward the base of the cliff. The scree field started 30 feet from the cliff base and spread east. For Danny's body to end up in the scree, he would have had to fall and then roll, or slide, or be carried by something. Rain, gravity, time. Or he would have had to fall from a different spot entirely, somewhere farther east along the shelf where the exposure changed angle. Or he hadn't fallen at all. Cole moved east along the shelf, step by step, reading each section. His eyes traced the edge, measuring grade and surface quality with an attention that came from 18 years of evaluating terrain where a wrong assessment meant someone didn't come home. 15 feet farther east, the shelf narrowed to 8 feet and the surface changed. Smoother here, with a thin layer of decomposed granite that would shift underfoot. Possible. A man could slip here, but the angle still directed a fall northeast, not into the scree field where the body was found. He pulled the notebook from his pack and sketched the layout. Distances, angles, surface conditions. The geometry didn't reconcile. APJ, who had survived INDOC, the 10-week selection course that eliminated 80% of candidates through pool drills and forced marches and sleep deprivation and the relentless, creative application of physical and psychological pressure, did not lose his footing on a granite shelf with clear sightlines and dry rock. Ghost had been pacing the shelf's edge while Cole worked, nose low, sampling. Now the dog stopped. His body locked into a point, left foreleg lifted, muzzle extended, tail rigid and horizontal. He was aimed at a spot below the shelf, off-trail, where brush had begun to regrow in the weeks since the fire had thinned the canopy. Cole moved to the edge and looked down. Below the point position, maybe 20 feet off the trail, a section of hillside showed the fresh scars of new growth pushing through fire-damaged soil. Beneath the green, the earth was darker than the surrounding ash field. A depression, roughly rectangular, partially obscured by the new brush. Something was buried there. Ghost held the point for 10 more seconds, then released and looked back at Cole. The message was clear. But Cole didn't climb down. Not yet. He noted the position in his notebook, marked it against the ridge features he could use to find it again, and turned back toward the cabin. He wanted to know more before he dug. He wanted to know who else had been digging. Good boy. Ghost fell in at his heel. But before they descended, Cole stopped at the edge of the shelf one more time. He looked out across the scree field, then back along the trail, then down at the point position Ghost had marked. 3 data points. The wallet, buried in the burn area below. The boot prints, circling disturbed earth near the same location. And now this. A depression below the ridge off any maintained trail in a spot no casual hiker would visit, containing something large enough for Ghost to hold a point on. Cole had spent 18 years assembling pictures from scattered evidence. In the field, you didn't always get the full image. You got fragments, A blood trail, a shell casing, a boot print in dust, the angle of a wound. And you built from those fragments a sequence that told you what had happened, and, more importantly, what was going to happen next. The sequence here was incomplete, but its shape was emerging. Danny had found something. Danny had documented it and buried a contingency package. Danny had died on this ridge in circumstances that didn't match the official account. And now, months later, someone was searching for what Danny had left behind. He opened the notebook and wrote 3 lines. The first was a set of GPS coordinates for the point position. The second was the compass bearing from the shelf to the depression. The third was a sentence he wrote in the same measured hand he used for weather observations. Fall site geometry, inconsistent with accidental death. Terrain assessment, deliberate. He closed the notebook, clipped the pen to the spine, looked at Ghost. Let's go. Ghost fell in at his heel, and they descended the ridge together in the flat light of a smoke-hazed afternoon, the burned forest standing around them in silent rows, like witnesses who had seen everything and would say nothing unless asked the right questions. The Forest Service District Office occupied a single-story building on the east end of Elk Bend's main street, sandwiched between a feed store that had reduced its hours to 3 days a week and a vacant lot where a gas station had stood before the mill closed. Cole parked across the street and sat in the truck for 2 full minutes, watching the building, watching the street, watching the pedestrians on the sidewalk and the vehicles turning at the intersection. Hank Ridley was standing outside the county building, 4 doors west. Cole recognized him from the name on the sign above the Ridley Timber office at the edge of town, a face he'd seen on a billboard driving in, sun-weathered and smiling beneath a hard hat. The words, Ridley Timber, Building Elk Bend since 1962, arced across the top. In person, the mayor was shorter than the billboard suggested, thick through the shoulders, his posture broadcasting authority even from 50 yards away. He was talking to 2 men on the courthouse steps, and as Cole watched, Ridley clapped one of them on the shoulder and laughed, a broad, confident laugh that carried across the street. Then Ridley's gaze shifted, found the truck, found Cole. For 3 seconds, they looked at each other across the width of Main Street, the smoke haze hanging between them like a scrim. Ridley's expression didn't change. He gave a small nod, polite, measured, the nod of a man accustomed to acknowledging strangers in his town, and turned back to his conversation. Cole got out of the truck. "Stay," he said to Ghost. The dog watched him through the windshield with amber eyes that tracked his movement all the way across the street and through the district office door. Inside, Jenna Ward was sitting behind a metal desk covered in topographic maps, aerial photographs, and printed documents held down by coffee mugs and a stapler and a rock that might have been decorative or might have been evidence. She looked up when the door opened, and something crossed her face. Not surprise, but a kind of recognition, as though she'd been expecting him and was only mildly annoyed that it had taken this long. "I need to talk to you." "Sit down." He didn't. He stood inside the doorway with his hands at his sides and the door still open behind him. The fire started on disputed land between the county survey line and the Forest Service boundary, land that Ridley Timber has been logging. Jenna leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms. "How do you know where the fire started?" "Burn pattern. The fire moved east with the wind, but the ignition point was west of the ridge, on the disputed acreage. You can read it in the char depth. Trees at the origin burned deeper, longer exposure. Trees farther east burned on the surface. She studied him for a moment. That's a very specific observation for a man who lives in a cabin with no phone. I'm observant. You're more than observant. She pulled a chair from beside the desk and pushed it toward him with her foot. Sit, please. He sat. The chair was metal, government issue, built for durability rather than comfort. Through the window, he could see the truck, Ghost's silhouette in the passenger seat, Ridley still on the courthouse steps, though the two men had gone. I'll help you with the fire investigation. I know that backcountry better than anyone in this valley. In exchange, I need access to whatever you have on Daniel Harlan's death. Jenna's expression shifted. The professional distance she'd been holding contracted slightly, and beneath it, something harder emerged. A woman who had spent weeks being stonewalled by county officials and was running out of patience and leads in equal measure. Why? Because I knew him. How well? Well enough. She held his gaze for a count of 5. Then she opened a desk drawer and pulled out a thin folder, set it on the desk between them. The fire investigation is federal jurisdiction. The death investigation was county. I don't have authority over what happened to your friend. But the fire's burn path crossed the exact ridge where he died, and the county has been blocking my access to that section of terrain for 3 weeks. They say it's a safety concern, unstable ground after the fire. It's not unstable. I've walked it. So have I. Something shifted between them. Not warmth. Neither of them was built for warmth in professional settings, but a recognition that they were holding different pieces of the same broken thing, and that assembling them required proximity they both found uncomfortable. What did you find up there? She asked. The fall site doesn't match the coroner's report. The angles are wrong. The terrain doesn't support an accidental fall for someone with Danny's background. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. Ghost archetype. Information came in controlled amounts, released only when the recipient had earned the next piece. What was his background? Air Force, like me. She absorbed that. Whatever she'd guessed about him, the rescue, the medical assessment, the way he moved in terrain, the cabin, the isolation. This confirmed it without explaining it, which was perhaps the most ghost thing Cole could have offered. The folder has the county's fire report from last November. Incident summary, coroner's finding, witness statements. There were no witnesses. Ghost jumped into the cab of Jenna's truck while they talked. Neither of them noticed for a full minute. When Jenna turned toward her vehicle and saw the German shepherd sitting in the driver's seat, ears forward, his expression suggesting he'd been waiting for someone to realize he'd already made the decision, she stopped. He does that? He's never done that before. He seems to have opinions about who he rides with. Cole didn't answer. He walked to the truck, opened the door, and Ghost hopped down without complaint, trotting back to Cole's pickup with his tail at a neutral height that conveyed nothing and everything simultaneously. They drove back to the cabin, Cole with the folder on the seat beside him, Ghost in the passenger seat, and between them the first thread of an alliance that neither of them had asked for, and both of them needed. The go bag was exactly where Ghost had pointed, They returned to the ridge 2 days later, Cole, Jenna, and Ghost, and descended to the spot below the shelf where the dog had locked into his point. The brush was thicker than it looked from above, new growth pushing aggressively through the fire-damaged soil, and Cole had to cut through a tangle of young alder before he could reach the depression in the earth. He dug with a folding shovel from his pack. Jenna stood above him on the trail, watching, her camera out, but not yet taking pictures. Ghost circled the perimeter of the dig site in slow, deliberate loops, nose working, tail level. 18 inches down, the shovel hit something that wasn't soil. Cole brushed the dirt away with his hands. A bag emerged. Military-style dry bag, heavy nylon, waterproof. The kind issued for field operations, where documents and electronics needed to survive immersion. It was intact. The burial had protected it from the fire, and the waterproof seal had kept the contents dry. He lifted it out and set it on the cleared ground, unrolled the top. Inside, a stack of printed documents held together with a binder clip. A USB flash drive in a plastic case. A prepaid cell phone, powered off, screen intact. A bundle of cash, 20s and 50s, maybe $2,000. And, at the bottom, beneath everything else, a sealed envelope. Cole stared at the envelope. His name was written on the front in handwriting he recognized. The letters were steady, evenly spaced, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write clearly under bad conditions, because clarity saved lives. Cole. He picked it up, turned it over. The seal was unbroken. Danny had written this letter, sealed it, packed it with everything else he considered essential, buried it where only someone who knew to look would find it, and then walked up to the ridge above and never came back. Jenna had climbed down to the dig site and was crouching beside the documents, her camera clicking. She looked at the envelope in Cole's hands, then at his face, and whatever she saw there made her stop. "Is that addressed to you?" He didn't answer immediately. He held the envelope with both hands, the paper clean and white against his dirt-stained fingers. And for a moment, the mountain and the burned forest and the woman beside him fell away, and there was only the weight of a name written by a dead man who had tried to reach him and failed. He opened it. Danny's handwriting filled half the page, the lines tight and even. Cole read the first paragraph standing in the hole he'd dug, with the smell of turned earth rising around him, and Ghost sitting 5 feet away with something in his mouth, a loose strap from the go bag that he'd pulled free and was holding, gently, as though completing the retrieval he'd started the night he brought the wallet home. "Cole, I know you won't read this unless something goes wrong, because I know you. You don't open things you're not ready for. But if you're reading it, then something did go wrong, and I need you to understand what I found and why it matters. There's a timber company in a town called Elk Bend, Ridley Timber. They've been harvesting federal forest land for at least 4 years using forged county survey permits that shift the property boundaries west. The county signs off because the mayor owns the company. I found the survey markers on a trail crew job last spring. They were 40 feet too far east. I pulled the permits. They're altered. I have copies in the bag." I tried going through channels, Forest Service Regional, State Lands Office. Nobody returned my calls. I think Ridley has connections beyond this valley. Or maybe nobody cares about timber fraud in a county with 1,200 people and no political leverage. Cole stopped. The next paragraph was different. The handwriting was the same, but something in the spacing had changed. Tighter, more deliberate, as though Danny had paused before writing it, and had chosen each word with a kind of care usually reserved for last statements. I called you a lot. I know you stopped listening. I know why. What happened on that mountain wasn't your fault, Cole. You carried me 400 meters under fire. You chose me, and the other choice was impossible. And I need you to hear that from the person you saved. You made the right call. But I'm not calling because I need the PJ. I'm calling because I need my friend. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. Cole lowered the letter. His hands were steady. His face was still. But something behind his eyes had broken open, and the sound that came from his chest was not a word and not a breath, but something between the two that carried the weight of 3 years of silence and all the phone calls he had never answered. Jenna was standing a few feet away. She hadn't read the letter. She was watching his face, and whatever she saw there was enough. Who was he to you? The man I chose to save. And then I let him die anyway. The words sat in the air between them, heavy and precise, and neither of them tried to soften them. Jenna looked at the documents spread on the ground, at the USB drive, at the cash and the phone, and the letter in Cole's hands. She was putting it together, the scope of what Danny had found, the risk he'd taken, the fact that he'd prepared a contingency bag because he understood that what he was doing could kill him. He knew it was dangerous. He knew, and he did it anyway. He sounds like someone worth finishing this for. Cole folded the letter and placed it in his jacket pocket against his chest, where the paper sat like a second heartbeat. Yeah, he does. Jenna spread the documents across the desk in the district office, weighting the corners with coffee mugs and her sidearm and a chunk of obsidian she used as a paperweight. Cole sat across from her. Ghost lay under the desk, flat on his side with one ear cocked toward the street, eyes half closed, but tracking sounds from outside. The fraud was systematic and precise. The county survey permits, there were 14 of them spanning 4 years, each showed property boundaries that placed the Ridley timber lease line 200 to 400 feet west of the actual federal boundary. The effect was cumulative. Each permit carved a little more federal forest land into the timber company's harvest zone. Danny had annotated the margins in pencil, measurements from GPS waypoints he'd taken during his trail crew work, showing where the real markers stood versus where the permits claimed they were. 4 years, Jenna said. She was photographing each document with her phone, building a record. Hundreds of acres. At current timber prices, we're looking at several $1 million in illegal harvest. And the county signed every permit. The county is Hank Ridley. He's the mayor, the largest employer, and the longest-serving member of the County Planning Commission. She set down her phone and looked at Cole. The permits are approved by the commission. Ridley's signature is on 7 of them. Cole picked up one of the altered permits and held it at an angle under the desk lamp. The boundary line had been redrawn, skillfully, but not perfectly. The original line was still faintly visible beneath the correction, a ghost of the actual survey pressed into the paper by the original pen. Danny found the markers in the field, pulled the permits, saw the discrepancy. And then he came here. And nobody listened. Somebody listened. Somebody listened well enough to bury him on that ridge. Jenna sat back. The office was quiet, except for the hum of the fluorescent light overhead and the distant sound of a truck on the main road. Ghost shifted under the desk, resettling, and his tags clinked once against the metal frame. Jenna pulled the USB drive from its plastic case and inserted it into her laptop. The screen filled with folder icons, labeled by date, organized with the same meticulous attention Danny had applied to everything. Each folder contained scanned permits, GPS logs, photographs of survey markers, and text files with his notes. He was building a case, Jenna said, clicking through the folders. Not just collecting evidence, organizing it for submission. These are formatted like a federal complaint. He knew the process. He was military. We document everything. She opened a subfolder labeled Audio and clicked the single file inside. A recording started. Danny's voice, steady and clear. And beside it, a second voice, rougher, less certain. The voice of a man being asked questions he didn't want to answer. "That's Garza," Jenna said. "He's a foreman at Ridley Timber. I've seen his name on equipment logs." Danny's voice on the recording. "So the markers at Section 14. Who moved them?" A pause, then Garza. "Look, I just do what I'm told. Hank says the line is here. I set the cut line here. I don't check the surveys." "But you know the federal markers are farther east." Another pause. Longer. "Yeah, I know." "And Hank knows?" "Hank drew the new lines himself, on the permits. I've seen him do it. He's got the originals in his office, and he traces over them with a straight edge and a different pen." The recording ended. Jenna sat back. Cole could hear her breathing, steady but faster than normal, and he recognized the sound, the controlled elevation of someone who has just found what they were looking for and is now calculating what it means. "Date stamp," Jenna said. "October 28th. 3 days before Danny died." He got the confession on tape, and 3 days later he was dead on that ridge. And someone accessed these files after he died. 3 times. She pointed to the file properties on her screen. November 15th, December 2nd, January 9th. The drive was removed from wherever Danny stored it, plugged into a computer, and the files were opened, but not deleted. They were checking what he had, seeing how much damage the evidence could do, and deciding whether to destroy it or leave it buried. She closed the laptop. They left it buried, which means they believe the go bag would never be found. Until the fire exposed the ground, and Ghost found the wallet. And the fire. She said it slowly, each word given separate weight. The burn path started on the disputed land, right where Danny found the markers. If someone wanted to destroy evidence of illegal harvest, stumps cut too recently, drag marks, equipment tracks that would show timber removal from federal land, Fire would do it. One match, 800 acres. Every physical trace of 4 years of theft gone. Cole nodded. It also destroyed any physical evidence at the place where Danny was killed. Blood, fabric, scuff marks on the rock. Anything the coroner didn't collect in November would have been sterilized by the fire. So we have motive, the fraud. Means, access to the disputed land and knowledge of fire conditions. A victim who was about to go public. And a pattern of concealment that started the night Danny died and continued through the fire. She looked at Cole across the desk. What we don't have is someone in this town willing to put their name on any of it. We need the USB recording and the permits for the federal case. We need a witness for Danny. She looked at him. Do you think anyone will come forward? Cole thought of Tull, the bartender, and his hand going flat on the bar. He thought of the 2 men at the back table and the deputy who came to check on a man nobody checked on. He thought about towns that run on one man's money and what happens to people who challenge the hand that signs the checks. Maybe, but not willingly. He stood. Ghost emerged from under the desk, stretching once before settling at Cole's side. Through the window, Cole could see the county building. Ridley's truck was gone. The courthouse steps were empty. The town looked as it always looked, quiet, ordinary, holding its secrets beneath a surface so unremarkable that most people would never think to dig. The USB drive files had been accessed 3 times after Danny died. The timestamps were clear. Someone knew what he'd found, and they were still looking. Cole found Burl Comstock on the 3rd try. The first 2 times, the old man wasn't at the elbow room. Tull said he came in most afternoons around 3, drank 2 beers, and left before the evening crowd arrived. He was 71, a retired logger who'd spent 40 years cutting timber in these mountains for 3 different companies, the last of which was Ridley. He drew a county pension. He lived alone in a house on the south end of town, maintained but not improved, clean but not decorated, a house that told you everything about its occupant without being asked. Cole waited at the bar on the 3rd afternoon. Ghost waited in the truck. Burl came in at 3:10. He was thin and bent, his shoulders carrying the permanent forward curve of a man who'd spent decades leaning into work, and his hands were oversized for his frame. Swollen knuckles, thick fingers, the hands of someone who'd held a chainsaw for more hours than most people spend sleeping. He ordered a beer and sat 2 stools down from Cole without acknowledgement. Cole gave him 10 minutes. Then he moved to the adjacent stool. You knew Danny Harlan. Burl's beer stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, his eyes fixed on the row of bottles behind the bar. I don't want trouble. Neither did Danny. Burl was quiet for a long time. The bar was nearly empty. Tull at the far end, polishing glasses, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the bottle shelf that didn't require him to acknowledge what was happening 2 stools away. No one at the back table today. Just the 2 of them. The afternoon light cutting through the window in a single band that crossed the floor between their stools. He came in here asking questions. Burl's voice was low, flattened by decades of diesel engines and chainsaw noise. And when he spoke, he didn't look at Cole. He looked at his beer, at the bar, at his own hands wrapped around the glass. Same as you. Same stool, matter of fact. Wanted to know about the survey lines, about the permits, about who signed what and when. What did you tell him? I told him to stop, Burl lifted the beer, drank, set it down. His hand shook slightly. Told him Ridley owns this town. The land, the jobs, the law. The school board, the planning commission, the volunteer fire department. You push against Hank, you push against everything that keeps this place standing. He listened, same as you're listening. Then he asked me something nobody had asked me in 40 years of working timber. What? He asked me if I knew the lines were wrong. Not whether I suspected, not whether I'd heard rumors, whether I knew. Burl turned the glass between his fingers. I told him I'd worked those ridges for Ridley for 12 years before I retired. I'd seen the markers move, not all at once, 100 feet one year, another 100 the next, slow enough that nobody who wasn't paying attention would notice. I was paying attention. I just didn't say anything. Why not? Because I had 17 years left on a county pension and a house that's paid off and a life that works as long as I don't look too hard at the parts that don't. He picked up the beer again and held it without drinking. Danny understood that. He wasn't angry about it. He just looked at me and said, "I get it, Burl, but someone has to." I told him to stop. Burl's voice dropped lower. Told him Ridley had connections, that the county would close ranks, that he was one man with a clipboard going up against the only employer in a 100-mile radius. He didn't listen. Said he'd been in worse places. Said he had a duty. The word landed between them. Duty. Cole felt it in his chest. The same word Danny would have used, because Danny was the kind of man who believed in things, even when the things he believed in didn't believe back. He came back twice after that, Burl said. Second time, he bought me a beer, and we sat here for an hour. He told me about his service, about Montana, about why he'd taken a trail crew job in a place where nobody knew his name. He said the mountains made sense to him, said the work was honest and the ground didn't lie. Third time was the last time I saw him. He came in, ordered a coffee, sat right there. Burl pointed at Cole's stool. He said he had enough to go to the state. He said he just needed one more thing. What did he need? A witness. Someone who could confirm the markers had moved. Burl set his beer down. I told him no. I told him I was sorry, but I couldn't do it. And he looked at me, not angry, not disappointed, just sad. He said, "I understand, Burl. I do." And then he left. That was November? 3 days before he died. The night Danny died. Where were you? Burl's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the door, then back to his beer. The shake in his hand grew worse. For 30 seconds he said nothing, and the silence had a texture to it. Dense, compressed. The silence of a man fighting against the weight of something he'd been carrying for 8 months. I was on Ridge Road. Couldn't sleep. Sometimes I drive up there at night when the insomnia gets bad. I saw Hank's truck, 2 in the morning, parked on the access turnout below the shelf trail. Did you see him? I saw the truck. Lights off, engine running. I kept driving. The words settled like sediment. Burl stared at his beer. Cole stared at Burl. At the far end of the bar, Tull had stopped polishing. "You never told anyone. I've got a pension tied to this county. A house. 30 years of my life invested in this place." He turned his head just enough to look at Cole directly for the first time. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, and behind the exhaustion was something Cole recognized, the particular shame of a man who knows he chose wrong and has been living with the knowledge every day since. "I told myself it was nothing. A man parked on a ridge road at 2 a.m. could be anything. Probably was nothing. It wasn't nothing. No." Burl's voice cracked on the word. It wasn't. Cole looked at the man beside him. The bent shoulders, the swollen hands, the red eyes that couldn't meet his for more than a second before sliding back to the bar. He looked at him and saw something he recognized with a clarity that felt like a hand closing around his chest. Burl had watched a truck on a ridge road at 2 in the morning and kept driving. Cole had watched a phone light up with Danny's name and kept not answering. Different distances, different darknesses. The same failure. The failure of a man who sees what's happening and decides that looking away is safer than looking closer. He understood Burl. He understood him completely. And that understanding didn't make it easier to sit beside him. It made it harder, because it meant that whatever judgment Cole wanted to pass on this man, he'd have to pass on himself first. And he wasn't sure there was a scale large enough to hold the weight of both their choices. "Would you tell someone now? Someone with authority?" Burl picked up his beer, drank the rest of it in one long pull, set the empty glass on the bar with a precision that suggested the act required his full concentration. "I'll think about it." The door to the bar opened. Both men turned. A broad-shouldered man in a county work jacket stepped in, saw Cole and Burl sitting together, and stopped. He looked at them for 2 seconds, then turned and walked back out. Through the window, Cole watched him pull a phone from his pocket as he crossed the street. Burl saw it too. His face lost what little color it had left. "That's Gavin Pruitt. He runs the mill yard for Ridley." He saw us talking. "Yeah." Burl stood, left a 10 on the bar. His hands were steady now, the particular steadiness that comes when fear solidifies into certainty. "He did." He walked out without looking back. Cole sat alone with an empty coffee cup and the knowledge that whatever window of cooperation Burl had cracked open had just been noticed by exactly the wrong person. Outside, Ghost was sitting upright in the truck cab, his muzzle aimed at the door of the elbow room, his nostrils flaring rapidly, sampling the air in quick pulses, processing whatever emotional residue Cole was carrying out of the bar and into the afternoon light. "Yeah, that went about as well as expected." The trespassing charges arrived 3 days later. A county process server found Cole at the Cenex gas station, the only predictable location in his routine, and handed him a folded document with a county seal and a judge's signature. The language was bureaucratic and precise. Cole Brannick was hereby ordered to maintain a distance of no less than 500 yards from the East Ridge Trail, the Ridley Timber Access Road, and all county-designated restricted areas within the fire perimeter. Violation would result in arrest. The order was signed by Judge Margaret Holt, who had been appointed to the bench 6 years ago with the public support of Mayor Hank Ridley. Cole read the document twice, Then he folded it and put it in his jacket pocket, beside Danny's letter. At the district office, Jenna was furious. "This is jurisdictional overreach. That ridge is on the boundary between county and federal land. A county judge can't restrict access to federal property." She was pacing. 4 steps east, turn, 4 steps west, her hands moving as she talked, organizing arguments in the air. "I can challenge this through the regional solicitor's office, but it'll take weeks. Maybe longer. Weeks we don't have." "I know that." She stopped pacing and faced him. "The USB drive has recordings. Danny recorded at least one conversation with a Ridley timber foreman. I've listened to part of it. The foreman admits the markers were moved on Hank's direct order. That's evidence. Real evidence. But I can't submit it through federal channels while a county order is restricting movement in the investigation area. It creates a procedural tangle that any defense attorney would use to suppress. So we're boxed in. We're slowed down. There's a difference." Cole stood at the window. Through the glass, Main Street looked the same as always. People walking, trucks passing, the county building standing solid and unremarkable at the center of town. Hank Ridley's truck was parked in front of it. That night, Cole sat in the cabin with the lantern burning low. The trespassing order lay on the table beside Danny's letter and the notebook full of weather observations. 3 documents. One told him the county didn't want him looking. One told him a dead man had been looking. One told him the wind speed and temperature on the day he'd stopped caring about both. Ghost lay by the door, not guarding it, just lying there, his chin on his forepaws, his eyes on Cole. Waiting. The dog had been doing more waiting lately, as though he understood that the period of action had temporarily closed, and what remained was the harder work of sitting with things that couldn't be fixed by digging or tracking or carrying objects home. The memory came without warning. Not the mountain, not the fire or the tracers or the dust. Something quieter. The debrief room at Bagram, 48 hours after the extraction. Cole in a metal chair. The team commander across the table. Fluorescent light that hummed at a frequency Cole could still hear if the cabin got quiet enough at night. "You brought one home, Brannick." The commander's voice was measured and flat, the voice of a man who had delivered this assessment before and would deliver it again. The decision was sound. Triage protocols were followed. You executed under fire with no viable alternative. I should have gone back. There was no time to go back. I should have found time. The commander had looked at him for a long moment. Then he said it again. You made the right call, Brannick. He said it the way people say things they need to be true. Twice, the way people repeat things they're not sure of. The cabin came back. The lantern, the table, Ghost by the door, his amber eyes steady, watching Cole's hands, which had closed into fists without his permission. The commander had told him he made the right call. Danny's letter had told him the same thing. 2 sources, same conclusion, and neither one had made it feel less like a lie. He unclenched his hands, opened the notebook, wrote the day's weather observations in the same careful script he always used. Temperature, wind direction, humidity, the small, measurable truths of a physical world that didn't require him to decide anything more complicated than whether to close the window. Ghost shifted. His ears rotated toward the cabin wall, toward the outside, toward a sound that Cole couldn't hear yet. Cole stopped writing, reached for the rifle, not lifting it, just touching the stock, feeling the grain of the wood against his fingertips. Ghost settled again. Whatever it was, it had passed. But Cole didn't sleep. He sat at the table with the lantern and the documents and the rifle within reach, and he listened to the mountain, and the mountain listened back. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, the silence stopped feeling like safety and started feeling like a trap. Hank Ridley came to the cabin on the Thursday evening when the light was turning the color of old copper and the air had finally begun to cool after a day that had pressed 96 degrees against the valley floor without mercy. Cole was sitting on the porch step because the cabin held heat in its timber walls and didn't release it until long after dark, and the step was the one place where the cross breeze from the creek drainage reached. Ghost lay beside him, body stretched along the bottom step, one leg dangling off the edge, eyes half closed, in a posture that looked relaxed but wasn't. The muscles beneath his fur held a low hum of readiness that never fully discharged, even in sleep. The truck appeared on the access road without warning. No headlights. Engine noise muffled by the trees until it was already close. Ghost heard it first. His head came up in a single sharp motion, ears locked forward. And then, something Cole had never seen before. The dog rose, took 2 steps backward, and growled. Not toward the sound, away from it. A retreating growl, the sound pulling away from the source rather than pushing toward it. His body moving between Cole and the cabin door in a pattern that was pure instinct. A dog that was saying, "This is wrong, and I want distance from it." Cole stood. His hand moved toward the door frame where the rifle leaned inside the threshold, fingers brushing the stock. But he stopped short of gripping it. Touching the rifle would change the conversation before it started. He let his hand drop and stood in the center of the porch with his feet shoulder-width apart and his weight balanced. The truck stopped 30 feet from the cabin. The engine didn't die. The headlights stayed off. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The trees held the last of the day's heat, and the creek whispered in the drainage below. And somewhere in the distance, a bird gave a single call and went silent. Then the driver's door opened, and Hank Ridley stepped out. He looked different from the man on the courthouse steps, smaller somehow, though his frame hadn't changed. His shirt was untucked on one side, the collar dark with sweat, and his hair sat uncombed and flattened against his forehead. The mayoral composure was gone, stripped away or burned through, Cole couldn't tell which, and what remained was raw, closer to the surface, like a wound that had been bandaged for a long time and had finally been exposed to air. A sidearm sat on his right hip in a leather holster, worn smooth from use, and his hand rested near it with the practiced casualness of a man who wanted it noticed without wanting to explain why. "Mayor." "Cole Brannick," Ridley said the full name slowly, tasting each syllable. "I know who you are now. Took some digging, but this is a small valley, and people talk when you ask the right questions. He stepped closer, 10 feet now. Ghost growled again, the same retreating sound, backing toward Cole's legs rather than advancing toward the threat. Air Force, pararescue, 18 years, 6 deployments. Medical separation after a mission in Afghanistan that went sideways. Disappeared into these mountains 3 years ago and hasn't come out since. You drove 12 miles of bad road to read me my resume? I drove up here to tell you something your friend should have heard before he made his mistake. Ridley's voice had changed. The mayoral smoothness was gone, replaced by something raw and compressed, a voice straining against whatever was holding it together, each word costing him more than the last. This town is mine. Not because I took it, because I built it. My grandfather cut the first timber in this valley. My father kept the mill running when every other operation in western Montana folded. I kept 1,200 people employed when the industry collapsed, and every consultant and government man said to close the doors and walk away. And then some seasonal trail worker, some stranger with a clipboard and a sense of duty, decides he's going to tear that apart because a survey line is 40 feet off? Cole didn't move. His breathing stayed even. His eyes moved between Ridley's face and Ridley's right hand, measuring the distance and the angle and the time it would take to close both, running the arithmetic that 18 years of training had carved into his nervous system so deeply that it operated below conscious thought. Danny didn't come here to tear anything apart. He came here because something was wrong, and he couldn't walk past it. He came here asking questions nobody asked him to ask. Ridley took another step, 8 feet. Ghost pressed against Cole's leg, and the contact was different from comfort. It was positioning. The dog had placed himself between Cole and the angle of Ridley's approach, covering the gap with his body, his growl dropping to a frequency so low it was more vibration than sound. He filed complaints, called offices, made noise, and when I tried to reason with him, when I tried to explain what this town needs and what it can't afford to lose, he wouldn't listen. Reason with him. I offered him money, enough to walk away comfortable. I offered him a job, good pay, steady work, the kind of thing a seasonal trail worker doesn't turn down. Ridley's hand tightened near the holster, the knuckles whitening against the leather. He turned all of it down, said he had an obligation, said he knew someone who could help. He meant you. The words landed with physical weight. Cole felt them in his chest, in the hollow space behind his sternum, where the things he couldn't digest had been settling for 3 years, calcifying into a mass that no amount of silence or distance or firewood splitting had been able to dissolve. What did you do to him, Hank? Ridley's jaw worked. His eyes were wet, not tears, not yet, but the sheen that precedes them, the body's last attempt to contain what the mind can no longer hold. Whether it was rage or guilt or the particular agony of a man destroying himself one sentence at a time, Cole couldn't tell. Maybe it was all three. Maybe they had become the same thing. I didn't push him. I want you to know that. I didn't touch him. Then what happened on that ridge? We talked. 2 a.m. I drove up there because he called me. Said he was going to contact the state attorney general in the morning, and I needed him to hear me one last time. Ridley's voice broke on the last 2 words, the fracture running through his composure and spreading outward until even his hands were shaking. We argued. I told him what it would mean for this town, for the families, for the people who depend on Ridley timber to keep the lights on. He listened. He always listened. That was the thing about him. He heard every word, and then he said no. He turned to leave. It was dark. The ground at the edge, scree, loose rock. He took a step, and his foot went out from under him, and I stood there. The words fell into the space between them and lay there, heavy, immovable, occupying the air with a weight that neither man could pretend away. Ridley wasn't looking at Cole anymore. He was looking at the ground between his boots, at a spot that wasn't there, at a memory that lived in the same place all such memories live, not in the mind, but in the body, in the hands that didn't reach out, in the feet that didn't move. And then you buried his wallet. I buried everything I could find. His phone, his wallet. I went back the next day and buried his pack farther down the ridge. His hand moved away from the holster and hung at his side, empty, useless. The coroner called it a fall, because that's what it was. He fell. After you argued with him on a ridge at 2 a.m, after you drove 12 miles in the dark to pressure a man who'd told you no 6 times already, after he fell, you stood there, and then you buried the evidence that he'd ever been anything other than a careless hiker. The silence between them stretched tight, carrying more weight than any of the words that had preceded it. Ridley's face had collapsed into something Cole recognized. He'd seen it in the mirror. He'd seen it in interrogation rooms at Bagram and in hospital corridors at Landstuhl, and in the eyes of men who had survived things they weren't sure they deserved to survive. It was the face of a man who had been carrying a weight so long that the carrying had become indistinguishable from the weight itself. "I know you've been digging," Ridley said. "I know you found the bag. I know the woman from the Forest Service has the documents." He straightened slightly, an effort that cost him visibly, his shoulders rolling back as though he were putting on a coat that no longer fit. "And I know what happens next. So I'm here to tell you one thing. Your friend made the same mistake, thinking he could come here and change things, thinking one man with evidence and a conscience could undo 40 years of what this town is built on. I know you left people behind, Brannick. I know what that does to a man. Danny told me about you, about Afghanistan, about the mountain and the choice you made." His voice dropped into something quieter, more dangerous because it was precise. "Don't make the same choice here. Walk away. Take the dog and go back to your cabin and stay there." He turned, walked to his truck. The door opened, closed. The engine caught and pulled the vehicle down the access road, and the sound faded slowly into the trees, swallowed by the distance and the evening air, until there was nothing left but the creak and the wind, and the echo of words that had been engineered to find the softest place in Cole's armor and press until it gave. Cole sat down on the step. Not slowly. He dropped, the way a man drops when a structural support fails. Ghost was beside him, pressed against his leg. The dog's weight was warm and solid, and Cole reached down and placed his hand on Ghost's neck, feeling the pulse beneath the fur, the steady rhythm of something alive and loyal and present that asked nothing in return except to stay close. Then Cole pulled his hand away, stood, walked inside, closed the door. Ghost stayed on the other side. For the first time in 3 years, Cole chose to be alone. Not because he wanted solitude, because he didn't trust himself to deserve the company. The dog sat at the closed door. He didn't scratch at it, didn't whine, didn't bark. He lowered his nose to the gap at the bottom and breathed into the space between them, steady and warm, and waited with the patience of an animal that understood loss and separation and had decided long ago that waiting was its own form of loyalty. The night passed in pieces. Cole sat at the table with the lantern until the fuel burned down and the flame guttered and died. And then he sat in the dark. He didn't sleep. He didn't move. He stared at the wall where the rifle leaned, and at the table where Danny's letter lay, and at his own hands, which had once been steady enough to thread a needle in the back of a Chinook flying through ground fire, and were now shaking badly enough that the shadows they cast trembled on the wood. Ridley had used Danny's own words: the mountain, the choice, the man left behind. He'd taken the heaviest stones in Cole's pack, the ones Cole had been carrying so long that they felt like organs, like parts of himself that had grown around the weight, and he'd pressed them harder, finding the exact angle that would do the most damage. And it worked. Because the truth was, Ridley wasn't wrong about what Cole had done. He had left someone behind. He had chosen Danny over the other man, and the other man had died. And no amount of protocol or triage assessment or commander saying, "right call," had ever made that arithmetic come out even. And then Danny had called. For months. Message after message, left on a phone Cole had stopped charging, because charging it meant the possibility of hearing it ring, and hearing it ring meant the possibility of answering. And answering meant re-entering a world where people needed him, and he might fail them again. He'd deleted the voicemails. He'd locked the door to his old life and walked away, and built a cabin in the mountains, and convinced himself that silence was a wall thick enough to keep everything on the other side. And while he'd been building that wall, Danny had come to Montana. Danny had found something worth risking his life for. Danny had reached out to the one person he trusted, and that person had been sitting 12 miles away, cleaning a rifle he never fired, writing weather observations for days that all felt the same, living a life so carefully emptied of connection that even a voicemail from a friend couldn't penetrate it. Danny had died alone, on a ridge, in the dark. And Cole had been alone in a cabin in the dark. And the distance between those two darknesses was 12 miles and a phone that wasn't charged. Sometime before dawn, Cole didn't know the hour. The clock in the cabin ran on daylight and habit, not numbers. He opened the letter again. He'd read the first half in the field, standing in the hole he'd dug. The second half he'd been avoiding. Not because he didn't want to read it, because he knew that whatever Danny had written in those final lines would be harder to carry than anything Ridley had said. Because it would come from the one person whose forgiveness Cole couldn't accept. He unfolded the paper. The last paragraph was written in tighter script, the words spaced more carefully, chosen with the kind of deliberation that Danny reserved for things he meant permanently. I called you. A lot. I know you stopped listening. I know why. What happened on that mountain wasn't your fault, Cole. You carried me 400 meters under fire. You chose me, and the other choice was impossible. And I need you to hear that from the person you saved. You made the right call. But I'm not calling because I need the PJ. I'm calling because I need my friend. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. He read it 3 times. The words didn't change, but something in how he held them did. The first reading was grief. A sound came from his chest that wasn't a word and wasn't a sob, and fell somewhere between the two, landing in the darkness of the cabin without echo. The second reading was guilt, heavier and more familiar, the guilt settling into the channels it had worn over 3 years of repetition. The third reading was something else, harder, sharper, closer to the thing that had carried him across 400 meters in Helmand with a wounded man on his back and fire all around him. It was anger. Not at Ridley, not even at himself, at the waste, at the deliberate, mechanical destruction of a good man by a system that valued silence over truth and compliance over conscience. At the fact that Danny had done everything right, found the evidence, filed the complaints, made the calls, tried the channels, and the only response he'd gotten was a ridge trail at 2 a.m. and a man who was too afraid of losing his legacy to let the truth survive. The door creaked. Cole looked up. Ghost had pushed it open. The latch had never been strong, and the dog had learned months ago that steady pressure against the bottom panel would pop it free. He stood in the doorway now, the first gray light of morning behind him, his silhouette sharp against the pale sky. He didn't enter, didn't retreat, just stood there, amber eyes fixed on Cole, reading whatever was being transmitted in the dark. The dog walked 3 steps into the cabin and lay down on the floor near the table, not touching Cole, not pressing against him, close enough to reach, close enough to matter. Space with presence. A minute passed. The gray light grew brighter. Then Ghost stretched his neck forward and bumped his nose once against Cole's hanging hand. Gentle, brief. A single point of contact that said everything neither of them had words for. Cole looked at the dog, at the letter, at the door that Ghost had opened because Cole couldn't. He folded the letter and placed it back on the table. He placed both palms flat on the wood, pressing down until the grain pushed back. Then he let go and stood. Jenna was at the district office when he arrived. The morning light came through the window at a flat angle that made the dust in the air visible, each particle turning slowly in the warmth. She looked up from her desk and said nothing for 5 full seconds, reading whatever was written on his face with the same precision she brought to burn patterns and survey data. What happened? Cole sat down across from her and told her everything. Not just Ridley's visit. Everything. Danny Harlan, Helmand Province. The 400 meters of open ground. The choice. Carry Danny to the landing zone or go back for the second man. The second man's name was Reeves, Staff Sergeant Kyle Reeves. Cole said the name aloud for the first time in 3 years, and it sat in the air between them, solid and irreducible. He told her about the helicopter that was 3 minutes late, about the dust and the tracers and the sound Danny made when Cole lifted him, the sound of a man whose body was broken, but whose trust was not. He told her about reaching the LZ and turning back and running toward the spot where Reeves had been, and finding nothing but brass casings and a boot, and a silence that had followed him across 7 years and 2 continents and 12 miles of Montana forest. He told her about the voicemails, about the phone he stopped charging, about the cabin and the weather notebook and the rifle he cleaned but never fired, about 3 years of trying to turn silence into a structure that could hold the weight of what he'd done and what he hadn't done, and about how Danny's letter had proven in 2 paragraphs that no structure built of silence can hold anything at all. The telling took 11 minutes. Jenna listened without interrupting. No notepad, no careful tilts of the head, no affirming sounds designed to signal empathy. She just listened. The way you listen when the person speaking needs a witness and not a therapist. And her hands were still on the desk, and her eyes never left his face. When he finished, the office was quiet. The fluorescent light hummed. A truck passed on Main Street. Ghost lay under the desk. He'd walked in without being told and settled himself beneath the metal frame as though the space had been reserved for him. So, what do you want to do now? Finish what Danny started. She nodded. One nod, precise. The USB drive has a recorded conversation. Danny and a Ridley timber foreman named Garza. The foreman confirms on tape that the boundary markers were moved on Hank's direct instruction. The recording is date-stamped 3 days before Danny died. 3 days. 3 days. I've already drafted the transmission package for the state AG and the Forest Service Inspector General. Full evidence set. The permits, Danny's GPS data, the recording, his written account from the letter. I can send it today. What about the trespassing order? Federal jurisdiction supersedes county restriction on federal land. The regional solicitor confirmed this morning. The order is unenforceable. I filed the challenge an hour ago. She allowed herself a small, precise smile, the first Cole had seen from her, and it changed her face in a way he hadn't expected, softening something he'd assumed was permanent. Ridley's judge can't restrict access to land that isn't Ridley's county. And Burl Comstock? That's on you. I can't compel a civilian witness. He has to choose. Cole stood. The path forward was clear in a way nothing had been since Ridley's visit. Stripped bare, harsh, impossible to misread, like a ridgeline after fire. He knew what needed to happen. He knew the order. He knew the cost. And for the first time in 3 years, the part of him that assessed and planned and executed was aligned with the part of him that grieved, and the two were pulling in the same direction. He walked toward the door, then stopped, turned back. Jenna was watching him from behind the desk. The morning light caught the side of her face, turning the brown of her hair a shade lighter and revealing a small scar at her hairline that he hadn't noticed before. Old, faded, the kind you get from fieldwork or from falling as a child, or from some story she hadn't told him and might never tell him. She looked tired. Not the exhaustion of a long day, but the deeper kind that comes from weeks of working alone against resistance, of filing reports nobody reads and making calls nobody returns. He held her gaze. This investigation. She spoke carefully, the way people speak when they're choosing between two versions of the truth and deciding how much of the honest one to share. It's the first one in 3 years that felt like it mattered, like the outcome would actually change something. It will. I know. She stopped, looked down at her hands, then back at him. My ex-husband used to say I was married to the job. He was right. I gave everything to this work because the work always made sense. People didn't. The job had structure, it had rules, it had answers you could prove with evidence and science. And then I got assigned to a fire in the middle of nowhere. And the first person I met was a man who lives in a cabin without a phone and understands evidence better than anyone in my office. Something shifted between them. Not a declaration, not a movement. A recognition, mutual and unspoken, that this had moved past professional and into territory neither of them had sought, and neither could pretend didn't exist. Cole didn't speak. He stood in the doorway with the morning light behind him and the weight of everything he'd just told her still settling in the room. And he looked at her, and for 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. Then Jenna's hand shifted on the desk, a small, involuntary motion toward him, her fingers lifting from the wood, reaching across 8 feet of government-issue carpet, stopping before the gesture could complete itself. Cole saw it. His body registered the motion before his mind could categorize it, and something in his chest, something he had spent 3 years sealing shut, cracked open a fraction of an inch. Not wide, not enough to see through, but enough to feel the air on the other side. Neither of them spoke. The moment held itself, suspended, and Cole understood that whatever happened next would not be decided by evidence or logic, or the kind of tactical assessment he'd relied on for 18 years. It would be decided by something he had no training for and no experience with, and no protocol to follow. He almost stepped forward. His weight shifted. 1 foot moved, then stopped. I'll go see Burl. She nodded. Okay. The word carried more than its 4 letters, and they both knew it. And neither of them said anything else about it. He turned and walked out. Ghost emerged from under the desk, stretched once, and followed. In the truck, Cole sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. Ghost watched him from the passenger seat. Don't. Ghost tilted his head. I know what that look means. The dog settled his chin on his paws and said nothing, which was, in its own way, a very articulate response. Burl Comstock answered his door on the second knock. He wore a flannel shirt buttoned to the throat despite the heat, and his eyes had the flat, exhausted quality of a man who has been expecting a visitor he hoped would never arrive. I'll do it, Burl said before Cole could speak. Pruitt saw us talking. Word gets to Ridley in this town faster than water flows downhill. If I'm going to burn for the conversation, I might as well make it worth something. You're sure? Son, I haven't been sure about anything since 1987. But I've been carrying this since November, and it's eating through the bottom of me. He stepped onto the porch, pulling the screen door shut behind him. His hands were steady now, locked into decision, the body accepting what the mind has committed to. I'll tell them about the truck. Time, location, plates. 2 a.m. on Ridge Road. That's what I saw, and that's what I'll say. After that, I'm done. You understand? I give my statement, and I'm done. That's enough, Burl. It better be. He looked past Cole toward the street, where the afternoon sun was turning the asphalt soft. Danny Harlan came into the elbow room and sat where you sat and asked what you asked, and I told him to walk away. That's on me. Every day since November. That's on me. So I'll do this one thing, and maybe it won't fix what I should have done then, but it's what I've got. It's enough. Burl nodded once, went back inside. The screen door closed with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The Ridley Timber office sat at the north edge of town, a low metal building with the company logo painted across the front in letters large enough to read from the highway. Ridley Timber, building Elk Bend since 1962. The paint was fading at the edges, blues and greens losing saturation under years of sun and weather. Cole drove past it once, circled back, and parked across the street. Jenna's truck was already there. She stood beside it with her phone in her hand and her badge visible on her belt. And when Cole walked up, she slid the phone into her pocket. It's sent. AG's office, Forest Service Inspector General, Regional Solicitor. Everything. The permits, the GPS data, the recordings, Danny's letter, Burl's preliminary statement. She paused. They'll have people here within 72 hours. But I wanted to give Ridley the chance to hear it from us first, not from a convoy of federal vehicles. Why? Because Danny believed in doing things the right way, even when the people involved didn't deserve it. Cole looked at the building. Through the front window, he could see Ridley sitting at a desk, alone, his head bent over papers that probably didn't matter anymore, in an office that would belong to someone else before the year was out. The building looked smaller from outside, the way things always look smaller when you understand what they really are. All right. They walked in together. Cole signaled Ghost, palm flat, pushing down. The dog sat at the truck, but his eyes followed them through the glass door and didn't leave, his body shifting from resting to ready, his weight forward on his forepaws. The office smelled of diesel and sawdust and the particular staleness of air that hasn't been circulated in a long time. Ridley looked up when the door opened. His face moved through 3 expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, then calculation, then a stillness that resembled composure but wasn't. Jenna Ward, Forest Service. She didn't extend her hand. You know Mr. Brannick. I know him. Ridley's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who has rehearsed his calm. What do you want? Jenna placed a printed document on his desk. As of 40 minutes ago, the State Attorney General and the Forest Service Inspector General have received a complete evidence package documenting the alteration of county survey permits and the illegal harvest of federal timber from designated national forest land. The package includes 14 original permits with forensic annotation, GPS survey data collected by Daniel Harlan, and an audio recording of a Ridley Timber employee confirming that boundary markers were relocated on your direct instruction. Ridley stared at the document. His hand moved across the desk surface, not reaching for it, restless, searching for something to do with the energy his mind hadn't directed yet. A witness has also provided a statement placing your vehicle at the Ridge Trail access point at approximately 2 a.m. on the night Daniel Harlan died, Jenna continued, her voice level and measured, carrying the weight of each sentence without strain. That statement has been included in a formal request to the state AG to reopen the investigation into his death. The office was silent. No hum from the heater, no sound from the street. Just the two of them standing, and Ridley sitting, and the document lying on the desk between them. And the silence had a quality Cole recognized from rooms where decisions were being made that couldn't be unmade. Ridley looked at the document for a long time. He didn't touch it. His hands rested on the desk, fingers spread, and Cole watched them the way he'd been trained to watch hands. Not the fingers, but the tendons, the small muscles that telegraph intention before the fingers move. A man deciding to reach for something tells you with his forearm before his hand ever gets there. "You think this is justice?" Ridley's voice was quiet now, stripped of the anger that had driven it at the cabin. What remained was something older, more tired. The voice of a man who had been running from a fixed point for 8 months and had finally been caught. "You think some attorney general in Helena is going to drive 4 hours to care about survey markers in a valley nobody's heard of?" They already have. "And Danny? Is this going to bring him back?" Ridley looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the capillaries broken along the lower lids, and Cole realized the man hadn't been sleeping. Maybe not for weeks, maybe not since November. Is a negligent homicide investigation going to give him another chance to walk off that ridge? No, but it gives him the truth. Something moved behind Ridley's eyes. A calculation completing, or a calculation failing. His right hand shifted on the desk, sliding east toward the drawer. His fingers found the brass handle. Cole saw it, and felt the distance between himself and that drawer compress into a single calculation. 3 steps, 2 seconds, 1 variable. The drawer opened. Ridley's hand went inside. "Hank." Ridley stopped. His hand was in the drawer, the muscles of his forearm locked, his body suspended between one decision and another. His breathing had changed, shallow, arrhythmic, the breathing of a man whose autonomic nervous system had taken over from his conscious mind. Cole took 1 step forward. Not aggressive, not defensive, centered. He'd done this before. Not in an office in Montana, but in rooms in Bagram and Kandahar and a village in the Korengal whose name he could never spell. Rooms where men with weapons and desperation and the conviction that they had no options left needed someone to show them that they did. The step was measured. 18 years of training distilled into a single shift of weight. He kept his hands visible, open at his sides, palms forward, fingers relaxed. The universal grammar of, "I am not a threat." Danny came here to do the right thing. He came alone because nobody else would listen. He filed complaints and made calls and did everything a man with a conscience is supposed to do when he finds something wrong. You could have let him. You could have listened. Instead, you chose this. But you can still choose different, right now, this second. You can take your hand out of that drawer and put it on the desk and let this end the way Danny wanted it to end. With the truth. I'm not a killer, Brannick. The words came out broken, each syllable a separate effort. I know you're not. Danny fell. I believe you. But everything that happened after, the burial, the cover-up, the fire, the trespassing order, the deputy at my door, that was you choosing. Every day for 8 months, you woke up and chose to keep this buried. And every day, it got heavier. I know what that feels like, Hank. I carried something for 3 years that should have taken me 3 minutes to face. It almost cost me everything. You can put it down. Right now. The room held its breath. Jenna stood motionless at Cole's left, her hand near her badge, but not on it. Her body still, letting Cole run the de-escalation the way a fire investigator lets the incident commander run the scene. Not because she lacked the authority to act, but because she understood that this moment required a voice Ridley would hear, and that voice was Cole's. Through the front window, Ghost was standing at the truck, no longer sitting, his body rigid, head low, ears flat against his skull. The dog had read the scene through the glass, the postures, the tension, the angle of the hand in the drawer, and had shifted into something Cole had never seen from him. Not aggression, readiness. If that door opened wrong, Ghost would be through the glass before it finished breaking. It didn't open wrong. Ridley's hand came out of the drawer. Empty. He placed both palms flat on the desk, a surrender so complete it changed the atmosphere of the room, and his head dropped forward, chin touching his chest, and the sound that came from him wasn't a word. It was structural. The sound of something load-bearing finally giving way after holding too long. Outside, vehicles. A county sheriff's car pulling up, followed by a sedan with state plates. Jenna had made the call before they'd walked in. The timing was deliberate. Danny would have approved. Not because it was tactical, but because it was right. The door opened. A deputy from the state entered and spoke quietly to Ridley, whose palms were still flat on the desk, whose eyes were closed. More people followed. Procedure filled the room, careful and methodical, and the particular vocabulary of institutional accountability replaced the silence. Cole stepped back to the wall. Jenna stepped beside him. In the movement and voices and the shuffling of authority asserting itself, their shoulders touched. Neither pulled away. He would have liked how you did that, Jenna said. Cole didn't answer, but he didn't move away either, and the touch held. Small, deliberate, a point of contact that asked for nothing and offered everything, and meant more than any word either of them could have chosen. Days passed. The smoke cleared. Not all at once. Smoke never leaves that way. It thinned gradually, pulled east by a shift in the upper atmosphere, and each morning the mountains emerged a little sharper against the sky, their edges returning from the blur of August into the hard, clean lines of September. Cole tracked the change in his notebook: visibility, particulate count, wind direction. And one morning, he wrote a single word at the bottom of the page that had nothing to do with weather: clear. The federal response team arrived on a Monday. 3 vehicles, 6 investigators. Enough jurisdictional authority to override every county order Ridley had put in place. Jenna coordinated with them from the district office. Cole gave his statement. 4 hours, recorded, thorough, covering everything from the wallet to the go bag to Ridley's cabin visit. He told it chronologically, factually, without editorializing. The debrief voice, stripped of everything personal. When the interviewer asked how he felt about what had happened, Cole said, "I'm not the one who should be feeling things about this. Danny should be." Burl Comstock gave his statement the same day. He walked into the county building at 9 in the morning, wearing a clean shirt and carrying nothing. And he walked out 90 minutes later, looking smaller but steadier. His hands weren't shaking. On the courthouse steps, he stopped and stood in the sun for a full minute, his eyes closed, his face turned upward. And then he went home. Ridley was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. His attorney issued a statement. The County Planning Commission suspended all active timber permits pending boundary review. The investigation into Danny Harlan's death was formally reopened as a potential negligent homicide. None of it felt like victory. Cole hadn't expected it to. Justice wasn't an arrival. It was a process. Slow, imperfect, grinding. And the man who deserved to see it completed was buried in a veterans' cemetery outside Billings, under a headstone that listed his rank and his dates, and nothing about the survey markers he'd found 40 feet east of where they should have been. Cole drove to the cemetery on a Wednesday. Ghost rode in the passenger seat, his nose near the cracked window, sampling the air of the highway that Cole hadn't driven in 3 years. The landscape changed as they crossed the divide, mountains giving way to high plains, the sky opening up until it felt like standing inside a bowl made of light. The cemetery was quiet. Government-issue headstones stood in rows, white against green, the geometry of service and sacrifice made visible in stone and grass. The rows ran north to south, each marker identical in shape and size, and the uniformity that had once been designed to honor equality in death now struck Cole as something else. A kind of silence made physical. Thousands of voices reduced to name, rank, and dates. He found Danny's marker in section 14, 3rd row from the access road. Daniel R. Harlan, Sergeant, United States Air Force. 2 dates separated by a dash, and the dash contained everything: INDOC, the deployments, Helmand Province, the 400 meters, Montana, the survey markers, the ridge at 2 in the morning, the fall. An entire life compressed into a typographic mark between 2 numbers. Cole stood in front of it for a long time. Ghost sat beside him, his amber eyes on the headstone, his posture still but attentive, as though he recognized that this place and this stone meant something, and that the proper response was presence rather than action. Cole placed a letter against the base of the marker. Not Danny's letter, his own. 2 pages in the same careful handwriting he used for weather observations, though these observations were of a different kind. Measurements of distance and failure, and the slow, grinding process of understanding what you've lost only after you can no longer get it back. He weighted the letter with a piece of granite he'd carried from the ridge trail. The stone was warm in his hand from the drive, and when he set it against the headstone, it clicked once, a small sound that carried across the silent rows. I should have answered, Danny. He stood there. The wind moved through the cemetery, bending the grass between the headstones, carrying the dry smell of High Plains autumn. The flag at the entrance snapped once and went still. In the distance, a groundskeeper drove a small mower along the perimeter, the sound faint and steady, ordinary in a way Danny would have appreciated after years of sounds that were anything but. Ghost leaned slightly into Cole's leg. Not pressing, just present. His weight a quiet affirmation that standing here, saying this, was the right thing to do, even though it was 3 years too late. The dog had never been to a cemetery before, had never stood among rows of identical stones, but he seemed to understand that this was a place where stillness was required, and that the man beside him needed to stand here for as long as it took. You were right about the mountains, Cole said. And you were right about carrying things alone. Ghost's ear rotated once toward the sound of Cole's voice, then settled. They drove back in the late afternoon. The road was quiet. The mountains returned as they crossed back over the divide, filling the windshield with dark timber and pale rock, and a sky so blue it looked corrected, the particular blue that only follows weeks of smoke, as though the atmosphere had been scrubbed clean and was overcorrecting. At the cabin, Cole sat at the table. He'd cleaned the space during the week. Danny's go-bag items returned to Jenna for the evidence file, the documents in federal custody, the trespassing order crumpled in the trash. What remained was simpler. The lantern, the notebook, Danny's letter, which he'd kept, and the prepaid phone Jenna had given him, sitting on the table beside the letter, its screen dark. In case, she'd said when she put it in his hand. He hadn't argued. He'd fixed the cabin door, not replaced it, repaired the latch so it sealed properly, then adjusted the hinge so it swung easier from the outside. The change was small. A door that closed when it needed to, and opened when it should. He'd made the adjustment on the day after Ghost had pushed it open, understanding, slowly, the way he understood most things that mattered, that the dog had been making a point, and that the point was correct. The afternoon faded. September light moved across the cabin floor in a long diagonal, and the temperature eased as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and the cabin cooled with a gentleness that felt less like loss and more like settling. Through the window, the mountains held the last warmth in their rock faces, glowing faintly, releasing the heat at the same pace they released everything, slowly, reluctantly, but eventually. Ghost lay by the door, not blocking it, not guarding it, just resting there, his body stretched across the threshold where inside met outside, his chin on his forepaws, his breathing deep and slow and even. He looked peaceful. Cole realized he hadn't seen the dog look this way in a long time. Maybe never. Ghost carried his own history. Whatever the shelter had done to him before Cole found him, whatever the first 2 years of his life had taught him about trust and the price of giving it, And that history was always present somewhere in his posture, in the set of his ears, in his tail that held a fraction lower than a dog without scars would hold it. But now, lying in the doorway with the September light pooling warm around him, the dog looked as though he'd set something down. Some burden Cole couldn't name and didn't need to, because he was beginning to understand the feeling from the inside. The phone rang. The screen lit up, pale blue against the darkening wood of the table, and a name appeared in clear letters. Jenna. Cole looked at the name, looked at the letter beside it. Danny's handwriting, visible through the fold, the last line of the last paragraph, words he'd read enough times now that they lived somewhere in his body rather than just his memory. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. He looked at Ghost. The dog's ear turned once toward the sound of the ring. A single rotation, precise, acknowledging, then settled back. His eyes stayed closed. His breathing didn't change. He was resting with the deep, full confidence of an animal that has determined the environment is safe and the person he is responsible for is present and the door is open and the world beyond it, while far from perfect, is no longer something that requires him to stand between it and the man sitting at the table. Cole looked back at the phone, at the name glowing on the screen. His finger touched the glass just as the screen went dark.